Order, order. I call on Luke Hall to move the motion.
I beg to move that this House has considered e-petition 231521 relating to ISIS members returning to the United Kingdom. Ms Howarth, it is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. This petition was signed by over 580,000 people, by more people than any other petition than the Petitions Committee has received in this Parliament, which is calling on foreign fighters who travel to Iraq and Syria to join the terrorist organisation Daesh, or referred to as ISIS, to have their citizenship revoked. The petition has gained extreme momentum in recent weeks following the publicity surrounding the case of Shamima Begum, her efforts to return to the UK, and the subsequent and saddening news of the death of her infant child. Despite the actions of the baby's mother, Jarrah was a British citizen guilty of no crime, and I mourn his death. The case of Shamima Begum is complex and highly emotive and is currently still ongoing. The Minister will have access to real-time details of this specific case, so I will not make any further mention of it, but discuss this petition text in the broad context in which it was originally started. The terrorism threat facing the United Kingdom and other Western nations do not just come from one front. Even as we are debating this matter here today, details of a shooting on a tram in Utrecht is still coming through, and I'm sure the thoughts of the whole House will be thinking of everybody affected in the hours ahead. The horrendous atrocities which took place in Christchurch on Friday also serve as a reminder that terrorists claim to operate in the name of many different races and religions on behalf of many groups and ideologies, and in different regions across the world. So this is a timely reminder that a single catch-all approach to dealing with all terrorists may not be the most suitable means to dealing with the problem. I'll therefore be using this opportunity to consider the petition text, the proposal that by restricting the return to the UK of anybody who has taken the decision to join terrorist groups and removing their citizenship and their passports, it would help keep the UK safe from terrorists and their actions. Mr Howarth, the Home Secretary recently stated that as many as 900 people who have been deemed to be a concern to our national security have travelled to Syria and Iraq to join terrorist organisations. Around 20% of those 900 have been killed on the battlefield, 40% remained in the region, and 40% have returned to the UK. That means around 360 people who are deemed to be a security concern have travelled to Iraq and Syria and since returned. And of those 900 people, more than 100 have been deprived of their British citizenship.
My honourable friend give way.
Be happy to give way.
Over 11,000 constituents signed this petition. I believe that those who are enemies of our country should not be allowed back into our country. But does my honourable friend agree with me that British citizenship is something that should not be taken for granted, and the decision not to allow ISIS members back into this country will act as a deterrent against others thinking about betraying our country?
Can I thank my honourable friend for that intervention she raises? She gets to the heart of this matter, and I think the fact that so many of her constituents have signed this petition demonstrates the strength of feeling in many communities, and I think I'll come on to look at in a bit more detail the issue of whether and when it's right to look at removing citizenship. So I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, because this petition text does state that a ban on all foreign fighters returning to the UK would send a message to others that membership of terrorist organisations will not be tolerated. And this is representative of a concern raised by many people that in recent years our democracies have taken too lax an attitude in dealing with extremism, allowing people to the freedom to act in unacceptable ways and which contravene traditional British values. There are many people and people who have contacted me since this debate was scheduled who worry about the precedence that is being set, which allows people to act as they please with no fear of any consequence, resulting in an environment where people feel able to join terrorist groups without any retribution.
Is the honourable gentleman aware that it is illegal under international law to strip away someone's nationality if thereby you leave them completely stateless?
Can I thank her for making that point? I think at the moment, what I'm trying to do is articulate the concerns of people who have signed this petition. In a minute, I will come on to make my own thoughts and comments about the petition text itself, but I'm very aware of the point that she has raised, and thank her for doing so. But I think it can't let us cloud the fact that this is a feeling that a lot of people, something that a lot of people feel, and that results in the a huge amount of support for the petition as it was signed. And it's those who have contacted me who feel very strongly that these reasons alone are a reason for change. There are also a number of people who have signed this petition who feel that at the point where foreign fighters come to the realisation that the area they have travelled to is not the utopia which they had anticipated, they feel freely able to return to their old lives in Britain without being prosecuted. And that taking a stronger line in denying these people the right to return to the UK at all would remove a substantial burden from our police force, who are required to spend time and resources in responding to terrorism-related incidents, and that their time can be better used on other issues, maintaining security and keeping people safe on our streets. A third argument that has been put forward is that the government can look at doing more to ensure that people who travel to countries like Iraq and Syria in order to aid and abet terrorism can be prosecuted and reliably prosecuted for their actions on return to the UK. Because at present, every person returning to the UK is questioned and investigated, and the government has made clear that wherever possible, prosecutions are levelled. But statistics show that of the 360 people who have returned to the UK, it's only 40 that have been successfully prosecuted. And it is, of course, incredibly difficult to gather evidence from regions such as the territories held by Daesh. And most people, I think, do recognise and understand the difficulties that are likely to arise trying to build a case against foreign fighters in order to level a charge against them that can be successfully prosecuted when they are in the regions. And I think people do support the new public offence of entering or remaining in a designated area, which will enable prosecutions to be brought against people travelling to regions which the government has designated as a terror risk. Therefore, whilst in some cases deprivation of citizenship may be suitable in certain unique situations, there are advantages to establishing that broader approach, whilst retaining the ability to strip citizenship in those situations where the circumstances dictate this would be the best course of action to keep our country safe. We must also consider...
Honourable Member give way. I thank the Honourable Member for giving way, and he is setting out very well the concerns that have been raised in this petition. Does he agree with me that we ought to look exceptionally at the idea of applying the declared areas offence retrospectively? This is an unusual, but it is not an unprecedented measure, and it actually could give a way of prosecuting many of the hundreds of people who have come back to this country and are apparently escaping prosecution at the moment.
I think he raises an extremely important point, and I think if that was something that our police and security services felt would help and aid them in the work that they do, then it's absolutely something that I would support as well. Because I think that we should consider the responsibilities that we have as a country for dealing with British nationals who have become radicalised by domestic terrorists. I do believe we should have faith in our British court system. If someone here is born and raised in Britain and radicalised in Britain, it ought to be the responsibility of the British government to hold them accountable for their actions. They should be tried in front of a British jury by British judges and held accountable to the standards required of our great legal system. And the precedents which blanket deprivation of citizenship in contravention of international law would set for other nations around the world should also be considered. Consider the scenario, for example, where a person from another country who becomes radicalised by a terrorist group has their citizenship from their country of birth revoked on their grounds of their eligibility for British citizenship. If the country of their birth were to decide to take the view that they wish to disown that individual, would it be right that the United Kingdom be required to be responsible for the detention, rehabilitation and guarding of the future welfare of that individual? And were such policies to be pursued by countries around the world, the extent of the problems which this could create are untold. For example, if the notion of suspected terrorists end up littered across the globe with no state prepared to take them and own them and prosecute them for the crimes they have committed. Some countries could choose to go further. They could cancel the citizenship of someone who has committed a crime at any point whilst they leave the country, and thus rendering them the responsibility of whichever state they happen to be found in at any particular time. And I think one of the partial parts of the solution to this question can be found in the 2015 Counter-Terrorism and Security Act, which introduced temporary exclusion orders, which enables the Secretary of State to render a foreign fighter's British passport invalid and require them to apply for a permit to return to the United Kingdom. This is clearly a positive step that has been taken, and in some cases the severe penalties for failing to comply include lengthy prison sentences, do go some way to providing that deterrent that my honourable friend talked about to people considering making the journey to join terrorist groups. And I think we should acknowledge here that the circumstances of every case are different, so the approach that we adopt must be able to allow British ministers to evaluate every instance based on its own circumstances, informed by the security services in this country through a framework and therefore a framework which allows this to happen effectively is required. We must be able to demonstrate that membership of terrorist organisations must never be tolerated under any circumstances and provide a greater deterrent to people considering the possibility of becoming foreign fighters. However, this can only be effective when part of a wide-ranging government framework for tackling these issues head-on and confronting the problem at an earlier stage. And that brings me on to my third point, the UK's counter-terrorism strategy and the measures it takes to prevent people from becoming radicalised in the first place. These are a vital aspect in ensuring that risk is minimised. I do support the government's Prevent strategy and the Counter-Terrorism and Border Security Act, which updates offences relating to the obtaining and sharing of terrorism-related materials. I was pleased to sit on that bill committee as it was stirred through. The new legislation, for example, ensures that material that is viewed or streamed rather than just downloaded is to form a permanent record is also now considered an offence. But there is possibly room for the government to go further. The report in 2018, co-authored by the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, considered the possibility of designating treason a new offence. And just to bring my remarks to a close, I think it is clear that the situation surrounding how we ought to proceed with cases of returning foreign fighters is clearly a complex one. Whilst there are a number of arguments that are put forward to support proposals to remove the citizenship of anybody who takes the decision to travel to Syria or Iraq to join Daesh or any other terrorist organisation, the evidence has shown that it is not always so simple to adopt a catch-all solution. Through contest and the government's Prevent strategy, along with the new Counter-Terrorism and Border Security Bill, I feel confident that we are taking the right steps, but there is, of course, more that can be done. I'd therefore like to ask the Minister what steps her department is taking in order to build a case for prosecution against those who have travelled to regions such as Iraq and Syria, and what assurances that she can give that the legislative framework is now in place to effectively prosecute any returning foreign fighters, and what more the government is doing to improve those prosecution rates of people who are coming back to the UK that we know have been in the region and are a threat to our national security. And finally, what consultation she has had with our security services and our police force to have a better understanding of what more powers that they would like to see us legislate for. And can I just conclude by sending again my condolences to everybody affected by the attacks in Utrecht and Christchurch, and saying that a tough and balanced approach from this government will uphold our principles of access to justice while continuing to be one of the safest countries in the world with security services that are the envy of the world.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 231521 relating to ISIS members returning to the UK. John Woodcock.
Thank you, Mr Howarth. It's good to see you in the chair, and it's a pleasure to follow that very measured and balanced contribution opening the debate from the honourable member. It's unfortunate that the timing of this debate has ended up clashing directly with an urgent question in the main chamber on far-right violence and online extremism in the wake of the Christchurch terrorist atrocities, which has meant that a number of us have had to choose between one and the other, which we didn't originally think was the case. Notwithstanding, let me set out, if I may, Mr Howarth, why I'm afraid that I don't agree with the central proposition of the petition, but to put the case that actually the government can do things which could be far more effective at tackling the menace of foreign fighters returning to the UK than the measures that it's currently pursuing, and in probably doing so in alienating most sides of this debate, which probably not for the first time on not for the first issue, but it is abhorrent to see anyone who proclaims themselves to be British to have been born here, to have benefited from the manifest advantages that our country and our society still can give to our citizens, to declare themselves effectively in opposition to everything that the UK, that Britain stands for, and to go as far as to travel to another country to take up arms or to aid those taking up arms against, sometimes at a certain moment, but fundamentally against the British state, to aid actions that could result in British armed forces being killed on the battlefield. So why is it that I think that that this petition, though I very much sympathise with the aims of it, is wrong? Well, I guess for two reasons. The first reason is on the grounds of effectiveness. What we would be essentially doing if we pronounce that no British citizen who went abroad should be allowed to go back to the UK, we would effectively be tearing up the rights, the long-standing lasting international relationships on the exchange of citizens. And that act would make this country less safe, not more safe. It would do the opposite of the actions of those that of the intentions of those that brought the petition forward. Now, I asked the Home Office, in the wake of the Shamima Begum case getting attention, I asked the Home Office to list the number of foreign citizens which it has attempted to deport from the country for terrorist-related reasons and other reasons. Now, the officials who draft the PQs on parliamentary question and responses on behalf of ministers said that information is not available. Frankly, this sounds absurd. Of course, the government can know how many foreign nationals it has deported over recent years, and the government should be open with figures anyway, but particularly, I would say, in areas where actually it probably stands to strengthen the government's overall position in maintaining this the international rules of deporting citizens from countries when they have become guilty of sufficiently serious offences. Because once we have the figures, I would be very surprised if it didn't show that actually, overall, the UK has deported more extremists from foreign extremists from our territory over the last 5, 10 or 20 years than it is looking to accept back through the deportation route. And therefore, if we were to unilaterally declare that this is just no longer going to happen, not only would we be in breach of those international rules, but also why would any other country accept a foreign national who was guilty of a terror offence or suspected of a terror offence, because you can deport people on less than full conviction in a British court. Why on earth would they accept any of their nationals back if we are refusing to accept British people back from foreign countries? I think this could spectacularly backfire. The second reason is actually a moral reason, and I believe really strongly actually that in instances where the British society has created this problem. Shamima Begum was born in Britain. She was a British person, and she was radicalised in Britain. She is our problem to sort out. And why? Why is it acceptable that we deport that problem to another country using whatever strangulated means it was, which hasn't been fully explained by the government? And surely, in circumstances like this, we need to be very careful as lawmakers in the message that we are sending out, because I'm afraid that there is, I think, an undercurrent often when people say these people are not really British. What do they actually mean by that? Often it means, I think, that they do not their skin colour is not the same as what they imagine a British person. They do not dress in the way that they imagine a British person should dress. They do not follow the same religion as they imagine that a British person should follow. And that is fundamentally wrong. We are an open society. We welcome people in. And once someone is born here and has been accepted as British, that is it. You know, we need to make this society work, and we need to do far better at rooting out the extremism which is in our own country, in our own communities, and so that leads on to the ways in which I think the government is not doing that sufficiently, and we should put our attention not on stopping those people, those Brits who've gone over and committed atrocities, from coming back, but actually finding a way properly to prosecute them for the evil acts that they have done. That is going to be the deterrent effect which stops future generations from going over. Yes, of course, I'll give way to the
I'm going to honourable friend. Does my honourable friend accept my point that telling first-generation British citizens of Bangladeshi origin that their citizenship can be stripped away at will is potentially counterproductive? And really what should have happened to Shamima Begum is she should be brought home, questioned, interrogated, and put on trial, if that was the right thing to do.
I thank the right honourable lady for that intervention, and yes, I do believe very strongly that Shamima Begum should be brought home and put on trial. I think it is deeply alarming that it seems possible that there is not sufficient evidence to try her, and that is one of the things that I'm going to go on in the points of which I'm going to conclude in ways in which I think the system ought to be strengthened, because I think anyone outside of a very narrow legalistic background looks at this case and looks at a woman who travelled over to the so-called Caliphate, Islamic State, with the express intention of supporting that Caliphate, who admits it openly to the journalists that found her and the subsequent ones who have interviewed her, who admits to supporting that Caliphate as part of a community. How on earth can she not be prosecuted for terrorist offences? And if we are in a position where if we are in a state where the legal position seems to be that you have to have proof of actively aiding and abetting violent acts or carrying out those violent acts directly, I think it is clear that the legislation is far too lax. So that is point. That is the first point that I would like the Minister to come back on, with the understanding that she is once again standing in for her colleague, the Security Minister. And by the way, if it's not too much of a detour, Mr Howarth, I just want to commend the Minister probably on behalf of everyone here, probably the House about what she apparently said in the margins of a vote to her right honourable friend, the former Foreign Secretary, about the issue of historic child abuse. But I won't say any more than that, and I won't expect her to comment in Hansard upon it. So we should be making sure that the terrorism laws are fit for purpose. If you go over there and you admit to being part and in general support of this organisation in whatever way, that means you are guilty of a terrorism offence and you should be prosecuted for it. Second, the declared areas offence. I and some of my colleagues, with respect to the Security Minister, he was also already on this track, pushed for a long time about the Australian-style declared areas offence to be brought into British law. It is finally that is finally being done. It has been weakened in a way which I am concerned about, but let's see. It's a good thing that it is on the statute book. It will mean in future conflicts, because the Iraq and Syria. The Iraq and Syria instance will not be the only one, but it means that in future that a case can be made simply for going over to an area which has been prohibited. But as I mentioned in the intervention to the honourable member before, there is surely such a potentially severe threat to national security which is being posed by the hundreds of returnees who it is apparently not possible to prosecute, or for whom the enforcement agents are not willing to put forward a prosecution, is surely in these severe times making that law retrospective to cover people who went out to the area during the conflict with Daesh, to make it possible to prosecute them if those people have a good reason to be there. They were genuinely part of an aid mission. They were genuinely there as journalists. They will be able to prove that. But it is palpably obvious that the majority of them were going over to support the caliphate, and it is the failure and the apparent unwillingness to countenance that kind of radical measure to hold them to account, which does lead people to lose faith in our judicial system, which leads them towards the kind of measures in the petition that has been set out today. So if the Minister can't give an answer to that, I would very much appreciate one from her colleague. The PREVENT programme, it's a matter of record that the government has announced a review of that. It's really important, I think, that members on all sides of this House, and I have to say, unfortunately, particularly on the opposition side, do not undermine and damage the purposes of the PREVENT programme by essentially mimicking the criticism which is pushed forward, pumped into our communities by Islamists who are determined to delegitimise the intervention of the British state. And too many times in recent years we have seen good people essentially taken in by this idea that British government should in some way not get involved in these issues at all. That is exactly, it's a very deliberate strategy. It is exactly what Islamists of different shades, from the apparently non-violent to those committed to violent jihad. It is exactly what they have intended to do, and it is very, very dangerous. Third, I hope that the government will reflect on the culture of secrecy which it still maintains over this issue. Look, we recognise that there are difficulties, and we recognise that it is awkward sometimes talking about the lack of success, but the government is doing itself no favours by how difficult it is to drag out information on its measures to tackle extremism. It took months and months and months for me to prize out of the Security Minister that figure of 40 successful prosecutions. Still, the government is refusing to give any details of the nature of those prosecutions, despite repeated requests by journalists. The Home Secretary said, with the permanent secretary sat next to him at a recent meeting of the Home Affairs Select Committee, agreed to my request to go off and look at that issue. I would like an answer soon, please, because the idea that you can keep secret the inefficiency of the British state in prosecuting people is a total fallacy. I mean, if you, it is quite clear that the message, if they are worried about a message going out into communities that actually you can do this and get away with it, well, there are literally hundreds of people who are living examples of that message in communities. So it is not going to be, it's not going to prevent potentially vulnerable people from finding out. It is solely, I would suggest, with respect to the Minister, a measure to cover the government's embarrassment. And if they want the cooperation across the House to find more effective ways to do this, I suggest they need to start by a greater level of transparency. Fifth, as the Honourable Member says, I do hope that the modernisation of treason laws is something which the government is looking at realistically. This is not something which we should simply stick on a press release to sound more draconian and in touch with the 19th century, but it is surely a measure in these difficult times that we ought to be examining closely. And so I would welcome an update from the government about, if it is taking this seriously, what steps it is taking to look at how this law could be modernised and made applicable to this current situation. And finally, I would suggest that toughening up our data sharing laws can be an important part of stopping foreign fighters before they make this journey abroad. There's been a debate in the main chamber over the proposed data sharing agreement with the United States. I don't propose to rehearse that again now, but we've seen over recent days the unwillingness of social media companies to acknowledge the level of responsibility, the level of impact that they can have, the appalling tragedies in Christchurch, which I haven't gone out of I haven't tried to look for the video which is being was clearly being shared far too readily on social media. Those deeply, deeply distressing images of peaceful Muslims going about prayer being gunned down. It is deeply shocking how slow, how reticent social media companies were to pull the plug on, well, they refused to pull the plug on their platforms while these vile video, which could clearly incite further acts of terror, was going on. So there is something at a very deep level wrong with the relationship between community, government, and these social media giants. That has to be addressed. I would suggest that one effective way in which it could be addressed, aside from this issue of taking down the platforms in emergency international situations like this, potentially. Another way in which it could make a palpable, significant contribution to fighting the extremism that leads people to going over to foreign lands is in requiring these companies to share with government the IP addresses and login details of every user who posts extremist material which the company themselves take down. We've got this weird situation at the moment where the government, where the social media companies are pretty much getting better, far more slowly than we would like, but they are upping their game in taking down extremist material. While much of it is too slow, there is far more being taken down than there was only a year ago. And yet the vast majority of this just disappears into the ether. Whereas every time, every instance of extremist material being shared online, being spotted by the companies, being taken down, is an opportunity for government to spot someone who has been radicalised or is being in the process of radicalised, rather than waiting to this point where it is too late and they have committed a terrorist act, either, God forbid, on British soil, or by taking the step to become foreign fighters or supporters of foreign fighters abroad. There is so much more that the government can be doing, and I hope that we hear in this debate and in the coming weeks ahead that it will step up this fight. Thank you, Mr.
Kevin Newland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Howarth. It's a pleasure to serve under you. Can I start by thanking the honourable member for Thornbury and Yate, which is something I've not said before, for setting out the petitioners' debate so well at the start. To do so in a balanced way can be quite difficult on such sensitive issues, but I think he handled that very well. He spoke of the declared area, as has been mentioned as well, to make it easy to convict those who do travel to conflict areas, and we tried during the course of the debate to put appropriate safeguards in place, but it's a measure that we welcome, provided the safeguards are in place. But it can also join them in sending our condolences to those involved in atrocities in Utrecht and in Christchurch. It's important that, as the urgent question is on in the Chamber, that we do remember those who are victims of these extremists and terrorists. And that brings me on to Honourable for Barrow and Furness, who brought up the clash with the urgent question in the Chamber. And I'm always curious why we often are quick to label what's termed far-right violence and extremism as that, rather than terrorism. We're quick to call Daesh and Al-Qaeda or anything like that terrorism, but we seem to go in stages when we talk about the far right. We call it extremism and violence, and only after a certain time do we get to the words terrorism, which I find a little uncomfortable, if I'm honest. However, as I jokingly said before the start of the debate, the honourable member and I don't think have ever knowingly agreed on anything since my election in May 2015. Yet I found myself about halfway through his contribution agreeing with almost everything he'd said, and I even said here at one point. So I think it was a shock to both of us. I mean, it did diverge. It did diverge at one point, and subtle differences in opinion. But yeah, I very much welcome much of what he said. He made a very good point on the impact on international relations in what is an incredibly sensitive area. If we were to disallow the return of Daesh terrorists to the UK. And his last point, I think, is an incredibly important point about social media companies. And I think we'd all accept that there has been an improvement in the companies' reactions to taking down content and what have you. But too often that reaction is still far too slow, and there's still a long way to go with regards to the social media platforms doing their bit in regards to this. But so there's no doubt in the gravity and importance of the issue and of the petition before us, and I think we all have to recognise there's a deep sense of anger in the country, as evidenced by the near 600,000 signatures on the petition, 582 of which were in my own constituency of Paisley and Renfrewshire North. And we're all deeply concerned, regardless of what your opinion is on a petition or anything else, we're all concerned about the threat from Daesh, Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organisations and ideologies. And I very much feel the anger. I hear it at surgeries, I get emails the same as everybody else. I feel the anger of those who have signed the petition that we're debating today. However, I don't agree with the solution that it calls for. The petition asserts that removing citizenship from Daesh members would keep the UK safe from terrorism, but as a starting point, I think this is fundamentally flawed, and as we've heard, interventions flies in the face of international law, and the UK must meet its international obligations and allow the return of its citizens and ensure they face the full consequences of their actions. And if we don't take that responsibility, then on whose shoulders should that fall? To strip extremists and terrorists of their citizenship would leave a line of angry, radicalised and violent people in post-conflict regions and give them, through their extremist lens, further reason to wish violence upon the people of this country or of our countries. And Alex Young, Chief of MI6, said that although he was very concerned, as we all are, about the individuals making their way back from Syria and the region, he insisted that British nationals have a right to come to the UK. Further to this, it was also reported by the Times that MI5 see individuals who have joined Daesh as potentially valuable intelligence assets and continuing the fight against them and their murderous ideology at home and in the region. That said, I believe no one who has fought for or assisted a terrorist group will ever face a warm welcome in return to the UK. Many of these fighters have committed unimaginable acts of terror and violence against innocent people in the name of a fascist ideology. So of that there can be no doubt, and it's vital we recognise that if a UK citizen becomes isolated from society and susceptible to radicalisation, then it's our society and as a government that has failed to prevent this. And if the UK, as has been mentioned already, if the UK allows radicalisation to happen, then it is our responsibility to make amends and bring the UK national in question to justice. And having been the SNP frontbencher during the counter-terrorism bill, and I'm sure taking interventions from the member from Barrow and Furness, I very much look forward to the review of Prevent that the opposition secured during the passage of the bill, and will be seeking to ensure that it is independent and that the scope of the review is wide enough to be truly effective. It's not about, and just in response to a point that's made, it's not about watering down our approach to preventing terrorism, it's to make sure it's effective. And I think that's what we would all want to see. So, Mr Howarth, there's been a dramatic rise in the number of UK citizens losing citizenship from 2014 to 2017. So I'd ask the Minister to carry out a full review of the powers available to the Home Office to strip an individual's citizenship. Statistics show citizenship deprivations were used only a handful of times a year, and they rocketed from 14, just recently as 2016, to 104 the following year. And under the Immigration Act 2014, there's a requirement for the UK Government to carry out a review of the Home Secretary's power to revoke citizenship. And the first review was conducted by eminent QC David Anderson, now Lord Anderson, in his capacity as independent reviewer of terrorism legislation. But no subsequent review has been published, and the position of that independent reviewer is currently vacant. The next review would need to cover the period from July 2015 to July 2018. And on that note, I believe it's worth considering Solicitor Duncan Lewis's comments when he said, "The power to deprive UK citizens of their citizenship can only be used against the children of immigrant parents," meaning that the application of the policy is inherently discriminatory. It cannot be used on a white English person with white English parents. This aspect of the current powers must surely be addressed at the next review to address fairly obvious concerns about that policy. The Home Secretary also has powers to ensure that foreign fighters can return to the UK to face justice, and has powers which would enable him to manage the return of foreign fighters, provided he reasonably suspects they have been involved in terrorism-related activity and poses a threat to security in the UK. He could impose a temporary exclusion order, which has been mentioned, under the CT and Security Act 2015, This would permit return only on strict licence conditions. If an individual still considered a threat to national security, further restrictions on his or her liberty could be imposed through a Terrorism Prevention and Investigation Measure, or TPIM. It may be possible to prosecute under the Terrorism Act 2000, which includes offences of being a member of or aiding and abetting a prescribed terrorist organisation. But, Mr Howarth, to conclude, I shudder to think what state we would find a world if all countries abdicated responsibility for the terrorists that had been born in that particular country. The UK has been described as being in the vanguard of citizenship deprivation, with an approach that contrasts starkly with other European countries such as France or the Netherlands, which have returned their citizens from Iraq and Syria to face justice at home. Ireland, in a similar situation recently, will most likely not be revoking citizenship of a Daesh fighter returning there. And even Donald Trump tweeted that the UK should take back Daesh fighters captured in Syria and put them on trial. So surely this shows just how out of step we've become in the UK with regards to the rest of the world. And I haven't mentioned her by name thus far, although she has been brought up. The reason this issue has gained so much attention of late is, of course, the case of Shamima Begum, who has had her citizenship revoked by the government, a move which I wholeheartedly disagreed with. Surely she must come to the UK to face justice. But what has not gained the same attention is the death of our son Jara, an innocent newborn baby and a British citizen who died in a refugee camp in Syria, a child that, if returned, may have eventually went on to live a normal life in the UK. And I hope the government reflects on their actions or lack thereof in this particular case. So, Mr Howarth, our position is clear. The UK bears responsibility for all its citizens, and the actions of the Home Secretary are to be condemned. It is time for Daesh members to come back to the UK and face justice.
Diane Abbott.
Thank you very much, Mr Howarth. In the light of the terrorist atrocity in Canterbury, New Zealand, debating this petition, which is quite correctly expressing horror and condemnation of terrorism from whatever its source, is extremely timely. The petition expresses a deep sense of anger against terrorism, but it also poses the question, a very important policy question: what are we going to do about returning foreign fighters? Members opposite said British citizenship should not be taken lightly. Well, you don't have to tell the daughter of West Indian migrants that British citizenship is a pearl beyond price. I don't take it lightly. My parents didn't take it lightly, nor do I believe that the parents of some of these foreign fighters take it lightly. So I don't think this assumption that because your parents or grandparents migrated from somewhere, you don't take the notion of being a British citizen very seriously. I don't think that contention stands up. But a lot of this debate revolves around the particular case of Shamima Begum. And I've said before in the House, and I'll repeat it again for the avoidance of doubt, that Shamima Begum made some very bad, very stupid, and quite possibly illegal choices. She's also made some terrible statements in the media. I do not, and Labour do not, sympathise or excuse her views and her actions. But what we are concerned about on the opposition front bench is what should be done to genuinely make this country safer. But on the question of Shamima Begum, we also have to recognise that when she left this country to join ISIS, she was just 15. She'd clearly been groomed in her bedroom by the disgusting agents for ISIS. There is a lot of talk by members which seems to imply that she's wholly responsible for her fate. But of course, I thought with the Rotherham child sex abuse cases that this House had moved beyond blaming 15-year-olds who've been groomed entirely for their fate. We've recently discussed the cases of depriving Britons of citizenship before in the House, including the case of Shamima Begum. We now learn that other British women have been made stateless under the previous Home Secretary, but in secret. At least the current Home Secretary has disclosed, with a little prompting, that he's made someone stateless. That is an improvement on his predecessor. But he seems unable to tell us if he's received any advice from MI5 or MI6 and what they said about his decision to strip Shamima Begum of citizenship. He's unable to clarify what his other legal advice may have been. And it is not clear what steps, if any, the Home Office took to ensure the safe return of her son Jara, who was a British citizen and who was born before his decision. That son now lays dead, and Shamima Begum will now have buried 3 babies in Syrian soil in less than a year. I wonder if the Minister will be able to tell us whether there will be a coroner's inquest for Jara, Shamima Begum's son, and whether the Home Office is willing to facilitate contact between Shamima Begum and her legal representatives. When we have debated this issue, the Home Secretary has repeatedly hidden behind the words "he cannot talk" about individual cases. He appears to be pretending that Shamima Begum's case is somehow sub judice and cannot therefore safely be discussed. I'm afraid, and I put this as kindly as I can, that this is nonsense, and everyone knows it. The Speaker had to point this out. The Home Secretary had no compunction about naming Shamima Begum directly for the benefit of 400,000 readers of the Times in an article he wrote for that paper's edition of February the 17th, titled, "If you run away to join ISIS like Shamima Begum, I will use my power to stop you coming back," quote unquote. No problem then about discussing an individual case, clearly. Can ministers not see that this defence will not do? And the House can only speculate what line of defence ministers have when the almost inevitable legal challenge to their decision comes, if not in this case, then in other cases. And I would remind ministers they have already lost twice in court attempting to strip Bangladeshi descendant British citizens of their nationality. The duty of the government, as ministers like to remind us, is to ensure the safety and security of all our citizens. I would contend it's not for ministers to pick and choose who enjoys those rights. That is a matter of law. One is almost obliged to ask ministers, do they regard it as their duty to uphold the law, and do they regard it as their duty to defend British citizens like the defenceless baby Jara? And let me remind the House of Article 15 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. It says, everyone has the right to a nationality. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his nationality. Could the legal position be any clearer? So the idea that ministers can simply unilaterally deprive British citizens of their nationality and render them stateless is clean contrary to international law. And hopefully the Minister will explain how she proposes to get away with that. Shamima Begum had only one nationality. Now she has none. The same applied to her children. The Home Office decision, which I would contend was clearly against international law, deprived them all of their citizenship. Now, we all know in this House, citizenship also entails obligations as well as rights. The obligation, the basic obligations, include not breaking the law of the land. If Shamima Begum or anyone else in similar circumstances has broken the law, of course they should be allowed to return, but they should be investigated, interrogated, and, if appropriate, prosecuted, they are the responsibility of the British government. We are talking about British citizens. If Shamima Begum or anyone else is identified as representing a threat, our judicial system is there to deal with it. We are a country of laws, and surely it should be clear that dealing with a threat is preferable to not dealing with it and dumping it on foreign countries. Ministers like to say they're acting in defence of all of us from the terrorist menace. We see from Christchurch in New Zealand the terrorist menace, whether Islamic terrorists or far-right terrorists, is a very real one. But does anyone seriously claim that Shamima Begum was more dangerous than the upwards of 400 foreign fighters that have returned from conflict zones, having been fighters for ISIS, Al-Qaeda, or their disgusting offshoot splinter copycat organisations? Yet it is also reported that just 40 of these have faced any charges, and yet the others remain at liberty. There needs to be a more systematic approach to returning foreign fighters. There needs to be a proper programme for returning foreign fighters. Maybe an extension or an enhancement of the PREVENT programme. But the idea that one 19-year-old girl with a 2-week-old baby was somehow more dangerous than the 400 foreign fighters that have already returned seems to me a difficult position to defend. And I put to the House that no less a person than the President of the United States, Donald Trump, has said in terms that European countries ought to be prepared to take their foreign fighters back from Syria and related territories, and where necessary put them on trial. And it's not often I find myself agreeing with the President of the United States, but on this point he's correct. How can we expect other countries, other jurisdictions to deal with British citizens who have broken British law? This is a real threat to our security, these returning foreign fighters. This is the genuine terrorist threat, and I would contend the government has yet to respond to it adequately. We cannot ignore the fact that there are so many hundreds of British foreign fighters in Syria and associated areas. We need a proper programme to deal with them. Arbitrarily stripping people of their citizenship, contrary to international law, I don't think is the answer, not least because it will be challengeable in court. So I put it to ministers that instead of seeking cheap headlines, grandstanding against Shamima Begum, surely ministers' time would be better served and our security better enhanced by addressing the real risks of foreign fighters, the real threats, understanding that where they are British Britain's responsibility and should be subject to the British criminal justice system, and understanding also that we need, as the security services have said, actually in the past, we need a genuinely tailored programme to deal with the threat. It cannot be just a case of knee-jerk reactions to newspaper headlines. 400 foreign fighters returned to this country. We need a more systematic approach to keeping this country safe.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Howarth. And may I start, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and may I join colleagues from across the House in reflecting on the fact that we listened to this debate after the events, the terrible, terrible events in New Zealand over the weekend, the events in Surrey, and, of course, the events today in Utrecht. And we reflect, as I think has been said before, that terrorism takes many forms, but the purpose of terrorist acts is to undermine the rule of law, it is to frighten and to stop the values that we hold dear in Western society, and it is sickening that the way in which people choose to undermine our societies is by killing the most innocent of people, people going about their daily lives, whether in a place of worship, in a car park, or going about their day-to-day business during a working day. And so with that in mind, and bearing in mind as well that many colleagues will be in the main chamber focusing on the issue of far-right violence and online extremism, may I thank my honourable friend for Thornbury and Yate for the measured and balanced way in which he opened this debate. It is quite something that this debate has secured some 570,000 signatures. It is, he tells us, the most heavily endorsed petition to come before the House, and so it is with those great expectations of the public weighing heavily on our shoulders as well that I will, I hope, answer some of the points raised today. Of course.
I'm very grateful to the Minister. Is the Minister able to provide the House with figures about the numbers of far-right terrorists that we are engaged with, or perhaps are currently going through the PREVENT programme?
I'm so sorry. I was talking about the people who have signed the petition. I don't understand the link. If she wishes to clarify.
I apologise to the Minister. I was referring to her earlier remarks about far-right terrorists who were responsible for the terrorist atrocity in New Zealand. And in relation to her earlier remarks, I wanted to understand if she had available figures for the number of far-right terrorists that government agencies are currently engaged with and who are passing through the PREVENT programme. If she doesn't have the figures to hand, I will quite understand, but perhaps she can write to me and furnish those figures.
I'm very happy to provide that information. As she knows, the PREVENT programme, which I will be talking about later on, focuses on the threats and the risks posed by individuals, regardless of the ideology with which they claim to be acting, or which people who are worried about them and have referred them to the PREVENT programme, the Channel programme, are worried that they are operating under. Certainly the government has been very clear that people of far-right tendencies are very much part of that programme and being helped through that programme as well. We are very clear it's about the threat, it's about the risk, and these efforts to stop radicalisation apply regardless of the false ideologies that people appear to be subscribing to when they are put through that programme. May I also thank other members, including the Honourable Member for Barrow and Furness, for their contributions today. I know he has paid particular attention to this subject through the course of his parliamentary career, and I thank him and others for their thoughtful comments on, for example, the passage of the most recent Counter-Terrorism Act through this House. The government's priority is the safety and security of the United Kingdom and the people who live here. This includes managing the risk posed by those who have gone to fight in Syria or Iraq or to support terrorist organisations there, such as Daesh or Al-Qaeda. We have a range of powers and tools available to us to protect the UK from the national security risk posed by returning Daesh members. I know that members have referred to specific cases in the course of their speech. I cannot discuss individual cases in response as the Minister for many reasons, including the possibility that there may be related or future investigations or legal proceedings, and of course the government never comments on the operational capabilities and methodologies of the security services for very, very obvious reasons. All decisions we make must be rooted firmly in British values and in accordance with the law. This means that we cannot make people stateless, and UK nationals have the legal right to return to this country. But anyone who does return from taking part in the conflict in Syria or Iraq can expect to be investigated by the police and prosecuted where there is evidence that they have committed criminal offences that meets the code for Crown prosecutors. Around 900 people have travelled from the UK to engage with the conflict in Syria and Iraq against the advice of the Foreign Office. Of these, approximately 20% have been killed in the conflict and around 40% have returned to the UK. They have all been investigated and the majority have been assessed to pose no or a low security risk. The Honourable Gentleman for Barrow-in-Furness asked about the number of foreign nationals who have been deported. I don't have that information, I'm afraid, to hand, but I will ask the Security Minister to write to him with that information. We know that those who remain in the conflict zone include some of the most dangerous there are, choosing to stay to fight, to raise families or otherwise support Daesh. They turned their back on this country to support a group that butchered and beheaded innocent civilians, including British citizens. These individuals pose a greater threat to the UK than individuals who returned earlier in the conflict. They will have become desensitised to violence. They may have received combat training, intense indoctrination, and will have had the opportunity to expand their terrorist network. Where they pose any threat to this country, we will do everything in our power to prevent their return. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office advises against all travel to Syria, and since 2011 there has been no consular support available to British nationals there. We are resolute that we will not put British officials' lives at risk to assist those who have left the UK to join a prescribed terrorist organisation, and therefore cannot and will not actively provide assistance to any individuals who have travelled to the region. The Home Secretary can exclude non-British nationals from the UK and under the British Nationality Act of 1981 has the power to deprive any British national of citizenship status. Deprivation of citizenship is used in extreme cases where to do so is conducive to the public good and where the individual would not be left stateless. To do so would be unlawful. Deprivation is a powerful tool that can be used to keep the most dangerous individuals out of this country. Each case will be considered based on the information that is available, regardless of the gender, age, or family status. Since 2010, this power has been used around 150 times for people linked to terrorism or serious crimes. I know that obviously this is a matter of concern to colleagues, and so I emphasise again that Parliament has set out clearly the legislative basis for exercising the power and that this is a decision to be taken by the Home Secretary. Removing an individual's British citizenship is a weighty decision and for that reason is a matter reserved to the Home Secretary. However, he takes these decisions in light of carefully considered advice prepared by officials and lawyers. However, each deprivation decision does also have a statutory right of appeal attached to it that individuals can and do exercise so that the courts can review the appropriateness of a deprivation decision independently. Now, several colleagues have raised the issue of bringing people who return to this country to justice. My honourable friend raised it on behalf of petitioners, and the Honourable Gentleman for Barrow-in-Furness emphasised the importance of it. Those who have fought for or supported Daesh, whatever their nationality, should, wherever possible, face justice for their crimes in the most appropriate jurisdiction. Sometimes this is in the region where their offences have been committed. Where individuals do return, they will be investigated, and where there is evidence that crimes have been committed overseas, they should expect to face prosecution in the UK. There have been around 40 convictions of individuals prosecuted following their return from Syria, for a range of offences either connected to their activities overseas or as a result of subsequent CT investigations. This number includes a 10-year custodial sentence for Mohammed Abdullah, a British national convicted in December 2017 of Daesh membership after leaked documents from a defector revealed his role as a specialist sniper. And a minimum of 40 years was imposed for Khalid Ali, who was sentenced in 2018 for planning a terrorist attack in Westminster. But I will remind the Security Minister of the specific request made by the Honourable Gentleman for Barrow. In answer to questions posed by my honourable friend for Thornbury and Yate regarding new offences, or indeed offences available for law enforcement and for the CPS to prosecute, even before the recent extensions of extraterritorial jurisdiction in the Counter-Terrorism and Border Security Act, our courts could try cases involving overseas terrorism offences relevant to foreign fighters, including the offence of preparation of terrorism, for which the maximum sentence is life imprisonment, an offence of encouragement of terrorism. The maximum sentence was extended from 7 to 15 years in the Counter-Terrorism and Border Security Act. Training for terrorism is another offence, again, maximum sentence of life imprisonment, and membership of a proscribed organisation with a maximum sentence of 10 years. Honourable members have also asked about whether the government is considering a new law of treason, and this is something, this is of debate, it's a matter for debate, and the government has not reached a settled position, but our concern is that to prosecute terrorists for treason risks giving their actions a political status or a glamour they do not deserve, rather than treating them merely as criminals. And so that is why we've passed the Act very recently, which updates terrorism offences and introduces new powers to reflect the threat we face today from foreign terrorist fighters, thus providing the police and intelligence services with the powers they need to protect the public. So at this point in time, we do not believe there is grounds for introducing an offence of treason, but of course the government keeps all of these matters under review. In terms of the decisions to prosecute, to investigate and to prosecute, it is, of course, for the police and the Crown Prosecution Service to decide whether individuals should be prosecuted in accordance with the Code for Crown Prosecutors. And as has already been acknowledged, for crimes committed in a conflict zone, there is no national infrastructure, there is not a police force taking Section 9 witness statements or making notes about who said what or who did what. Obtaining evidence that is admissible in a UK court is extremely difficult, and that is the problem we have to face, which is why, where prosecution is not possible, we have a range of powers available to protect national security and monitor and manage the risk posed by terrorism suspects within the UK, including terrorism prevention and investigation measures and temporary exclusion orders to place conditions on people's return, including regular reporting to a police station and mandatory attendance on our de-radicalisation programme. The best way to reduce the risk posed by these individuals will be judged on a case-by-case basis. These decisions are based on advice and intelligence from the security services, counter-terrorism police where relevant, and specialist security and legal officials in the Home Office. We publish statistics on the total number of TEOs in place in the annual Disruptive and Investigatory Powers Transparency Report, in fact, last week, the Home Secretary has asked officials to expedite the publication of the next transparency report, which will include the most up-to-date annual figures on disruptive and investigative powers, including around TEOs and deprivation, because we recognise this is a matter of great concern to the House. The Counter-Terrorism and Border Security Act 2019 updated our terrorism laws for the digital age and modern patterns of radicalisation, closing gaps in some of existing offences and adding new ones, such as recklessly expressing support for a prescribed organisation or publishing their flag or logo online. This Act also creates a new power to ban British citizens from entering designated terrorist hotspots without legitimate reason. The designated area offence, along with most of the Act's provisions, will come into force automatically 2 months after royal assent in April. Decisions to designate an area will be based on a careful assessment of all relevant information, including sensitive intelligence, as well as open source information, and of course applying the tests of necessity and proportionality. The Honourable Gentleman for Barrow-in-Furness raised the issue of retrospectivity, which is an understandable point for him to raise. And again, this is where the balancing between our priority to protect the security of the United Kingdom must be, as it were, within the confines of the rule of law. And so in line with normal judicial principles, the power will not be retrospective, and it won't be possible to prosecute for travel to an area before it has been designated. But it will be an offence to remain in an area after it has been designated, even if the person has been there for some time. Individuals will have 1 month to leave the area, following which they will face prosecution if they remain. So I hope that answers or goes some way to answering his concerns. These powers and tools send a clear message to individuals that membership or support for terrorist organisations will not be tolerated. And of course, this is against the backdrop, as has already been discussed, of the PREVENT strategy, which seeks to help those who may be at risk of radicalisation and extremism, seeks to, as it were, put them onto another path, a path of lawfulness and away from criminality and potentially offences of terrorism by ensuring that they are able to obtain help locally from PREVENT officers and others to steer them onto a much, much better path. But the UK is doing all we can to help innocent people caught up in this conflict overseas. We have committed £2.8 billion to Syria since 2012, our largest ever response to a single humanitarian crisis, and we are on track to resettle 20,000 vulnerable refugees who have fled the country, with our national resettlement programmes resettling more than any other EU state in 2017. We do not have a consular presence within Syria from which to provide our assistance. Our position, therefore, applies as much to children as it does to adults. However, if British children are able to seek consular assistance outside of Syria, then we would work with local and UK authorities to facilitate their return. Children returning from Syria are likely to have been exposed to the conflict and to have experienced trauma. In some circumstances, they may also pose national security concerns that need to be managed carefully. A range of specialised support, some of which is funded directly by the Home Office, is offered to address many concerns ranging from safeguarding to national security, and our support will be tailored to the needs of each individual child. Local authorities and the police can use existing safeguarding powers to protect returning children, support their welfare and reintegration back into UK society, and minimise any threat they could pose within schools and to their local community. Given, of course.
On the question of children, which she was talking about a few sentences ago, we have seen that journalists, aid workers, UN officials can go in and out of these Syrian refugee camps. Why is it so impossible to make arrangements to protect British children?
Well, as the Right Honourable Lady knows, and as I've said in the speech twice now, I think, Syria does not have a consular. We do not have a consular presence in Syria, and the very, very firm advice of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office is that it is not safe to travel there. I know that obviously journalists and aid workers are travelling against that advice. That is a decision which they must take very carefully and seriously. We take very carefully and seriously. But we're very clear that we do not wish to put British officials at risk in an area, a part of the world which we have designated so dangerous that we have withdrawn consular support from.
I'm grateful to the Minister. I'm very well aware that that the government's advised people that it's not safe to travel to Syria. But she will aware that children, particularly children who may only be a few months old, would not be in a position to abide by this advice. So I asked the Minister again, would it not be possible, working with NGOs, to get these very young, often weeks old or months old, British children out to the nearest British consular presence, maybe on the border with Turkey?
As I say, I mean, first and foremost, of course, we do not want babies being born in war zones. And so I come back to the perhaps longer term answer, which is that we don't want people travelling there in the first place because it's not good for them. It's against very clear FCO advice. And we have been very clear for some years now that they are advised not to travel to that area. But with children, as I've already set out, if they are in a camp, then it may well be that aid workers and others seek access. It is against our advice. We cannot put officials at risk in that way, I'm afraid. And you know, this is very, very difficult. I don't think anyone pretends otherwise. But we've been very clear that Syria is an area, part of the world from which we have withdrawn consular support, and anyone going there does so against Foreign Office advice. Given the situation in the region, everyone who returns from Syria or certain parts of Iraq, including some children, must expect to be investigated by the police to determine whether they have committed criminal offences, to assess any safeguarding concerns, and to ensure that they do not pose a threat to our national security. Before I close, I note, of course, the comments, the completely reasonable comments in some cases that have been made about the role of social media and tech companies in this. Colleagues will know that the Home Office and others are working with tech companies to ensure that they clean up their own backyard. And we have seen some progress by some of the major technology companies, including the development of technology that can automatically detect and take down terrorist content. But this material continues to remain accessible. More needs to be done. And as part of our efforts to prevent the dissemination of terrorist content online, not only is the government preparing an online harms white paper, we work also with those in the advertising industry to make them more aware of the types of content that is appearing online and to highlight that their advertisements may unknowingly be appearing next to this harmful content. I must say the response we've received from the advertising industry in this respect has been very positive, and we will, I hope, see some real change over the coming months. But as this weekend has shown, there is a great challenge to the tech companies to ensure that when invidious material has been placed on their platforms, that they remove it as quickly as possible so that it cannot be forwarded or embedded in the web. And so I conclude by thanking the 570,000 people who felt moved to sign this petition, causing us to debate this important issue again in this House. The priority as a government is to ensure the safety and security of the United Kingdom and the vast majority of our citizens who continue to uphold our shared values. We will not allow anything to jeopardise this. Thank you.
Call Luke Hall if he wishes to conclude, in which case the question is that this House has considered e-petition 231521 relating to ISIS members returning to the UK. None of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.